Hello and welcome to a KPBS special, A Closer Look into Slavery. Today we will be explaining the hardships that a man named Dred Scott had to face. Keep in mind that slaves had very little to no freedom, and for a slave to be allowed a court hearing for freedom is a privilege and didn't happen very often. Now, without further ado, let's take a closer look into the life of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a man born into slavery around the 1800s in Virginia. He was first property to the Peter Blow family. The Blow family moved and resettled in Alabama in order to pursue farming. However, that was unsuccessful. The Blow family took Scott and relocated to Missouri, where they sold him off to a man named John Emerson. In 1836, he made a slave named Harriet Robinson, whose master was Major Lawrence Taliaferro. Taliaferro allowed Scott and Harriet to pursue a relationship together, and as a result, Harriet was sold into the Emerson residence. Together, they had 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys, but unfortunately, both boys didn't survive past infancy. Once Emerson died, Scott, Harriet, and their daughters were under control of Emerson's wife, Irene. Scott offered to purchase his freedom from Irene, but she refused his request. Having denied the request, Scott filed for a lawsuit with the help of a local lawyer who was willing to help Scott. The Dred Scott decision was a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court that people of African descent brought into the United States and held as slaves were, whether or not they were slaves, were not protected by the Constitution and could never be U.S. citizens. They were solely considered a piece of property. Now I know what you are thinking. You are wondering what happened during that first attempt. During the first attempt of his trial, Scott based his legal arguments on precedents such as Somerset v. Stewart, Winnie v. Whitesides, and others. Scott's lawyers argued that their daughter Eliza's birth on a steamboat between a free state and free territory had made her free upon birth. Most people expected that the Scotts would win their freedom with relative ease, since Missouri courts had previously heard over 10 other cases in which they had freed slaves that had been taken into free territory. Unfortunately, however, in June 1847, Scott's suit was dismissed and Scott had failed to provide a witness to testify that Scott was in fact a slave belonging to Irene Emerson. Fortunately for Scott and his family, they were granted a new trial. The jury in the second trial found Scott and his family legally free. However, unwilling to accept the loss of 4 slaves and a substantial escrow account, Emerson appealed to the Supreme Court of Missouri. In November 1852, the Missouri Supreme Court reversed the jury's decision, effectively overturning 28 years of Missouri state precedent, and held that the Scotts were still legally slaves and that they should have sued for freedom while living in a free state. I know what you are thinking again. You are thinking, wow, this is nice, but why is this important? Well, I will tell you. This is significant because people from African descent rarely have the opportunity to present themselves in front of a jury. Most of the time they were ignored and weren't able to proclaim his or her freedom. Dred Scott was lucky enough to find an abolitionist who was willing to help Scott and his family. Thank you, everyone, for watching this KPBS special. Now, if you will take the time to answer a few questions.